It was the dawn of January the 30th, 1886, when Tomas Rivera pushed open the heavy wooden door of his home. He did not step out immediately. He simply stood at the threshold, watching the deadly stillness of the Mora Valley. The air from the outside hit his wrinkled face not like a breeze, but like a fist forged of solid ice. It was 42 degrees below zero. Down in the valley, the towering wooden mansions of the wealthy settlers were entirely paralyzed, their expensive iron stoves glowing red-hot, while the families inside burned their last mahogany chairs just to keep their blood from freezing. Tomas glanced at the mercury thermometer nailed to his wooden fence post. It was dead. The silver liquid had frozen solid inside the glass, a terrifying phenomenon of nature that the vast majority of human beings will never witness in their entire lives. Outside, the world had been transformed into a brilliant, blinding white morgue. The wind had ceased, leaving behind a silence so absolute, so heavy, that it felt like the end of the world. With a calm, deliberate motion, Tomas slowly closed the door, sealing out the frozen apocalypse. He pulled the iron latch, and the screaming cold vanished, replaced by a profound, enveloping warmth. He turned around and looked into the dim, amber light of his strange, subterranean home. Spread across the dirt floor, sleeping on worn wool blankets, were 11 people. 11 souls. Among them were the wealthiest merchant in the territory, the master architect who had built the town's grandest estates, and the solemn preacher who had claimed to speak for God himself. Just 2 days prior, these very same people had stood before Tomas and called him a madman. They had called him a fool, an ignorant peasant clinging to primitive superstitions. They had mocked his home, laughing at the man who chose to live in a dirt hole while they built their grand, fragile monuments to the sky. Now they were huddled together, breathing the perfectly stable 66-degree air that radiated silently from the deep thermal embrace of the earth. They were stripped of their pride, stripped of their arrogance, but they were alive, completely, undeniably alive, saved by the very dirt they had spat upon. But to understand how the proudest men of the valley ended up shivering on the floor of a man they profoundly despised, we must rewind the clock. We must go back 18 months to the golden, deceitful summer of 1884, when this silent war between modern arrogance and ancestral wisdom truly began. Tomas Rivera arrived in the territory of New Mexico on a wooden wagon pulled by 2 exhausted graying mules. He was 58 years old. His back was permanently bent from decades of relentless labor in the wheat fields of his youth, and his hands were as thick and calloused as old saddle leather. He carried no grand ambitions, no desire for wealth, and no need to prove his worth to any man. His wife, Maria del Carmen, had died 6 months earlier from typhoid fever, her final breaths taken in a hot, crowded room in Texas. His 3 sons, blinded by the frantic illusion of instant wealth, had abandoned him to chase the gold rush in California. Gold they would never find. Tomas was left completely alone, accompanied only by the heavy silence of his memories. $120 in silver coins wrapped in an oily rag, and a solemn promise he had made to his dying wife as he held her fragile hand. Live, Tomas. Simply live. The Mora Valley was a breathtaking, ruthless executioner wearing the mask of paradise. In the summer, it was undeniably beautiful, painted with endless golden prairies and framed by majestic blue mountains resting on the horizon. But it was a place of brutal extremes. The wealthy Anglo settlers who had arrived after the annexation of the territory completely ignored the nature of the land. They brought their money, their catalogs, and their immense egos. They built their houses exactly as they did in the civilized East. Thin wooden walls, steep pitched roofs, and towering brick chimneys. They erected homes that looked like they belonged in the mild, polite neighborhoods of Boston or Philadelphia. These were houses built on the arrogant assumption that money could simply buy obedience from the weather. Tomas watched them build, his dark eyes observing the thin pine planks going up. He said nothing. Instead, he walked to the land office and bought 4 acres of dirt on the far outskirts of the town for $30. It was a plot of land that absolutely no one wanted. It was nothing more than a gentle, rocky slope facing south, covered in dry sagebrush and wild weeds. The land agent, a young man wearing a spotless velvet vest and a pocket watch, actually laughed as he stamped the deed. He warned Tomas that the parcel was a miserable waste of money, too far from the main creek for easy water, and entirely exposed to the brutal winter winds that would inevitably sweep down from the mountains. Tomas did not argue. He simply nodded, offered a polite smile, and signed the papers with large, trembling, uneducated letters. That first night on his new land, Tomas did not build a fire. He slept underneath his wagon, staring up at a canopy of stars so bright and piercing they looked like bullet holes in a sheet of black velvet. And in that vast, high desert silence, he closed his eyes and remembered. He remembered his grandfather, Sebastian Rivera, a man who had never learned to read a single printed word, but who could read the soil, the wind, and the seasons as if they were his own skin. Sebastian had been born in these lands long before the maps were redrawn and the flags were swapped. The old man had spent his life observing the ruins of the ancient ones, the Pueblo natives who had thrived in this unforgiving desert 1,000 years before any European had ever laid eyes on it. The ancient ones did not fight the earth. They did not build tall, arrogant structures to challenge the wind. They built inside the earth. They let the planet hold them. Tomas could almost hear his grandfather's raspy voice whispering in the cold night air. "The earth is your mother, mijo. When it is freezing outside, she is warm inside. When it is burning outside, she is cool inside. The wood rots. The iron rusts. The glass breaks. But the earth does not change. The earth does not lie." The very next morning, as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, Tomas picked up a rusted shovel and began to dig. Before we witness the grueling labor of this solitary man, and before we watch the arrogant elite of this valley face the most humiliating and terrifying lesson of their lives, I must pause and ask you something. You who are listening to this history, who understand that true wealth is not measured by the size of your windows, but by the depth of your roots. Tell me, guardian of your own legacy, from which city or country are you watching this story unfold? Leave it in the comments below. And if you believe, as Tomas did, that ancestral wisdom and quiet humility will always outlast modern arrogance, I ask you to subscribe to this channel. Leave your like and share this audio documentary with someone who needs a reminder that the loudest man in the room is rarely the smartest. Join our community, for we are the keepers of the stories the modern world has desperately tried to forget. Tomas stepped onto the slope of the hill, feeling the texture of the red clay beneath his boots. He did not measure with complex tools or surveyor's equipment. He measured with his steps, 12 steps long, 8 steps wide. He marked the perimeter with loose stones. He was not digging a grave, as his neighbors would soon claim, nor was he digging a basement. He was carving a horizontal womb straight into the side of the hill. He was preparing to harness a principle of physics and thermodynamics that the millionaires in the valley below could not even begin to comprehend. The work was agonizing. Each thrust of the rusted $2 shovel into the hillside was a battle against a landscape that had baked under the New Mexico sun for centuries. The soil was a stubborn, unforgiving mixture of dense red clay and jagged limestone fragments. Every shovelful weighed like lead, pulling at the tendons of Tomas's aging shoulders. He did not dig straight down like a man sinking a well or digging a grave. Instead, he dug horizontally, piercing the very belly of the gentle slope, hollowing out a cavern that would soon become a living, breathing lung of thermal mass. The August sun beat down upon his back like boiling oil. His hands, though already hardened by decades of agricultural labor, blossomed with angry blisters that burst, bled, and turned into fresh, thick calluses. He worked from the fragile gray light of dawn until the sky bled into a bruised, orange twilight. When the darkness finally claimed the valley, he would drag his exhausted body to the freezing creek, wash the dirt and dried blood from his arms, and fall asleep beneath the wooden bed of his wagon, staring at the stars. He had initially calculated that the excavation would take him 3 months. It would ultimately take him 5. As the weeks bled into one another, the sheer absurdity of the solitary Mexican man digging a hole in the side of a barren hill began to draw the attention of the valley's elite. Up on the prime real estate by the river, the symphony of modern progress echoed through the air. The sharp cracks of iron hammers, the rhythmic grinding of crosscut saws, the heavy thud of imported lumber being dropped from horse-drawn freight wagons. They were building their mansions of pine and oak, raising thin, hollow walls to the sky. And from their towering, fragile palaces, they looked down at the old man in the dirt. The first to pay a visit was William Harrison, the proprietor of the town's general store and the wealthiest merchant in the territory. Harrison was a large, imposing man whose waistline spoke of expensive beef and imported wines. He rode a magnificent black stallion, his velvet vest straining against his chest, a heavy gold pocket watch secured by a chain that jingled with his every movement. He had arrived from Kansas 3 years prior, armed with generational wealth, and had immediately commissioned the largest house in the valley. A 2-story monstrosity with 14 glass windows shipped by train from Denver, and a white picket fence that gleamed in the sun like a row of false teeth. Harrison pulled the reins of his horse, stopping just a few feet from the mouth of the excavation. He pulled out his gold watch, checked the time as if the old man's presence was a tax on his schedule, and looked down at the dirt-stained laborer. "What in God's name are you doing, Rivera?" Harrison asked, chewing on his heavily accented Spanish as if the words themselves tasted of cheap leather. Tomas paused. He drove the blade of his shovel into the earth, leaned his tired weight against the wooden handle, and wiped a thick layer of sweat and red dust from his brow with a ragged cloth. "I am building my house, Senor Harrison." Harrison let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the hillside. "A house? In a hole? My friend, that is not a house. That is a tomb. You're going to kill yourself in there when that mud ceiling caves in on your head. We build with timber and nails now. We are not badgers." Tomas did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He merely looked at the merchant's expensive boots, then at the thick dirt walls surrounding him. "The timber rots, senor. The earth only sleeps." Harrison shook his head in profound pity. He turned his horse around, muttering loudly enough for the wind to carry his words down the road. "These people, they will simply never learn to live like civilized men." The physical exhaustion was one thing, but the psychological attrition had only just begun. 3 days later, the shadow that fell across the entrance of the cave belonged to Pastor John Fletcher. The Methodist preacher was a man as thin and rigid as a birch tree, with pale, judging gray eyes that always seemed to be searching for a sin to condemn. He carried a heavy black Bible tucked under his arm as if it were a loaded weapon. Fletcher had recently overseen the construction of the town's church, a towering structure of white pine that looked majestic from the outside, but was essentially a wooden wind tunnel, full of drafts and invisible gaps. "Brother Rivera," Fletcher announced, his voice carrying the solemn, theatrical boom of a Sunday sermon. "I have heard troubling whispers regarding your project. As a shepherd of this flock, I must warn you. The Scripture teaches us that man was created by the Almighty to walk upright upon the earth, not to scurry and hide beneath it like a serpent or a mole fleeing the light." Thomas carefully set his shovel down. He took off his sweat-stained hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. "With all due respect, Pastor," Thomas replied, his voice calm and melodic. "The good book also teaches that the Lord made the earth and everything within it. If He in His infinite wisdom placed a quiet warmth deep inside the dirt, is it a sin for a cold old man to borrow it?" Fletcher's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. "That sounds like primitive Catholic superstition, brother. I strongly advise you to pray for discernment. A true Christian home points its roof toward the heavens. It does not bury its head in the mud." The preacher turned on his heel and marched away, his boots kicking up dust, already planning his next sermon on the dangers of pagan ignorance. But the most cutting blow came a week later, delivered by the cold, calculated logic of Carl Zimmermann. Zimmermann was the valley's master carpenter, a towering German immigrant with hands the size of smoked hams and a thick blonde beard. He was the architectural genius behind the wooden mansions, a man who worshipped the rigid laws of angles, iron nails, and sawn lumber. He did not laugh like Harrison, nor did he preach like Fletcher. He simply stood at the edge of the excavation, his sharp blue eyes analyzing the exposed soil, the arch of the ceiling, and the thick juniper logs Thomas had bought to brace the roof. After several minutes of heavy, intimidating silence, Zimmermann spoke in surprisingly fluent Spanish. "Señor Rivera, I have built structures from the freezing winters of Pennsylvania all the way to this desert. I know load-bearing weight. I know the breaking point of timber. And I am telling you, as a professional, that what you are doing is mathematical suicide. Do you know how much a square meter of saturated soil weighs? Tons. One heavy rain, one minor tremor in the bedrock, and that ceiling will crush you into paste." Thomas nodded slowly, acknowledging the man's expertise. "I understand your concern, Señor Zimmermann, but my grandfather taught me that undisturbed, compacted clay has a memory. If I shape the arch correctly and let the earth settle onto the juniper beams, the weight pushes out, not down. It will be as strong as the stone of a mountain." Zimmermann scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Your grandfather was a peasant, Rivera, not an engineer. Physics does not care about your grandfather's memories. I will offer you a charity. Come work on my crew. Sweep the floors. Carry my lumber. I will pay you enough to buy decent timber, and I will show you how to build a real house, a civilized structure." "I thank you for your charity," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I have already spent all I have on this. I must finish it." Zimmermann spat a thick wad of tobacco onto the red dirt right at Thomas's feet. "Then die in your dirt hole," he muttered in German, walking away disgusted by the old man's stubbornness. That night, the temperature dropped sharply, hinting at the brutal winter that was marching toward them. Thomas sat at the half-finished entrance of his earthen home, eating cold beans straight from a tin can. Down in the valley, he could see the glowing amber windows of the wooden mansions, shining in the dark like fireflies trapped in glass jars. He could hear the faint melodic sounds of pianos, the clinking of crystal glasses, the distant laughter of men who believed they had conquered the world. He looked at his blistered, bleeding hands. His muscles screamed in agony. He thought of his dead wife, of his absent sons, of the profound, crushing loneliness that surrounded him. He felt the terrifying weight of their mockery. They were educated men, wealthy men. What if they were right? What if he was just an old, broken fool digging his own grave in a foreign land? Thomas closed his eyes. He pressed his bleeding palm flat against the cool, compacted red clay of his wall. It felt solid. It felt ancient. "Live," he whispered into the dark, echoing his promise. He put the empty tin can down, picked up his shovel by the light of the moon, and continued to dig. Tomas Rivera was not an engineer, but his blood carried a blueprint far older than any university textbook. As he hollowed out the belly of the hill, shaping a cavern 12 steps long and 8 steps wide, he was tapping into a brilliant survival mechanism mastered by the ancient Puebloans: passive geothermal heating. The physics of his dirt hole were as elegant as they were invisible. 2 meters beneath the surface, the earth is entirely blind to the seasons. While the surface bakes in a 100-degree summer sun or freezes under a sub-zero winter blizzard, the deep soil remains remarkably constant, hovering naturally around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By digging straight into the hillside, Tomas was effectively sinking his home into a massive, infinite blanket of thermal stability. To create headroom without compromising the structural integrity of the hill above him, he dug 3 feet down into the floor, creating a slight, sunken basin. He left the clay walls completely bare, simply smoothing them with his bleeding hands and a wet cloth until they looked like polished, reddish-brown stone. The roof required the utmost precision. If Zimmerman was right about anything, it was the crushing weight of saturated soil. But Tomas did not build a flat roof. Following his grandfather's whispered memories, he carved a gentle arch, allowing the weight of the earth to press outward toward the solid walls rather than straight down. He reinforced this arch with 8 incredibly thick juniper logs he bought from a local woodcutter for $12. Across these logs, he wove a tight lattice of dry branches, followed by a thick layer of golden straw purchased for $1. Finally, he covered it all with the original soil and wild grass he had initially excavated. From the outside, the hill looked entirely undisturbed. But his true masterpiece of low-tech engineering was the chimney. The wealthy settlers down in the valley built their chimneys straight up, tall, proud columns of red brick that pierced the sky. But a straight chimney acts like a violent vacuum. It sucks the hot air from the fire and shoots it directly into the freezing atmosphere, wasting up to 80% of the heat. Tomas did not have the luxury of wasting heat. Instead, he carved a narrow, angled flue that traveled diagonally through the thick dirt of the hillside for nearly 30 feet before finally emerging near the top of the ridge. He lined this angled tunnel with flat river stones, sealing them with a mixture of wet clay and wood ash. Because the smoke had to travel in a slow, ascending zigzag through the earth, the intense heat of the fire did not escape into the sky. Instead, it was captured by the stones and absorbed directly into the millions of tons of earth surrounding the cavern. The hillside itself became a colossal thermal battery. He finished the structure with a facade of reclaimed wood, scraps the town blacksmith was going to burn. He sanded them down to build a modest front wall facing directly south to catch the low arc of the winter sun, installing a solid door and a single, small, second-hand window. By the first week of November, the labor was done. Tomas stood back and looked at his home. From the main road, it was virtually invisible. There was no grand silhouette, no towering roof, no painted porch. It was just a weathered green door and a small window tucked humbly into the sweeping curve of the landscape. The total cost of his home: $12 for the juniper beams, $1 for the straw, $8 for the door and window, and $2 for nails and a shovel. $23. Down by the river, the wooden mansions, with all their drafts and architectural arrogance, had cost their owners anywhere from $150 to $300. The children of the town quickly dubbed it the Mole's House. The adults, laughing behind their hands at the general store, called it the Madman's Tomb. Tomas paid them no mind. He simply moved in. On his first night inside, the temperature outside plummeted to 22 degrees. A bitter, howling wind swept down from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, stripping the last dead leaves from the cottonwood trees. Inside his cavern, Tomas knelt before his stone hearth and lit a small fire. He did not use thick, heavy logs. He used exactly 4 thin pieces of split pine. The smoke curled upward, hesitating for a moment before being drawn smoothly into the angled, stone-lined earthen flue. He sat on the floor, wrapped tightly in his heavy wool blanket, and he waited. He waited to see if the master carpenter was right, if the ceiling would groan and collapse, burying him alive. He waited to see if the preacher was right, if God would punish him for hiding in the dark. He waited to see if the merchant was right, if he had truly wasted his final years building a freezing grave. An hour passed. The fire burned down to glowing orange embers. Tomas slowly unwrapped the heavy wool blanket from his shoulders. 2 hours passed. The deep, absolute silence of the room was broken only by his own steady breathing. He unbuttoned his thick canvas coat and draped it over a chair. By the 3rd hour, the air inside the earthen room was so profoundly, comfortably warm that Tomas actually had to crack the front door open for a moment to let a rush of cool night air inside. He looked at the small iron thermometer he had hung on the clay wall. It read 66 degrees. It did not fluctuate. There were no drafts creeping across the floor. There was no wind whistling through invisible cracks. The massive weight of the earth had absorbed the heat of those 4 small logs and was now slowly, steadily radiating it back into the room like a giant, invisible mother holding him in a warm embrace. Tomas Rivera laid down on his canvas cot, closed his eyes, and for the first time since he had buried his beloved wife, he smiled. A deep, quiet smile of absolute relief. His grandfather was right. The earth did not lie. As November surrendered to a brutal December, the pendulum of suffering swung violently toward the wealthy. The valley was gripped by a bitter, dry cold that regularly plunged to 0 degrees at night. In his magnificent 2-story home, William Harrison was bleeding money. His $40 imported Franklin stove was a black iron beast that demanded constant feeding. Because hot air naturally rises, the heat from the stove rushed up the central staircase, gathered at the high ceilings, and bled rapidly through the thin wooden roof. His 14 beautiful glass windows, completely devoid of insulation, acted like giant blocks of ice, sucking the warmth from the rooms. Harrison was burning 50 massive logs a day just to keep his family from shivering. He was spending $5 a week on firewood, a small fortune, and yet his wife still slept under 3 heavy quilts, her lips pale, cursing the drafts that rattled the floorboards. Carl Zimmerman, the master builder, fared no better. He had used layers of tar paper between his wooden walls, a modern Eastern technique, but the relentless New Mexico wind found every single microscopic gap. His house groaned and shrieked in the night, the freezing timber popping like distant gunshots as it contracted in the cold. He too was burning a staggering amount of wood, watching his profits literally go up in smoke. and Pastor Fletcher's towering wooden church was a catastrophe. During Sunday services, his congregation sat huddled in their pews, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their teeth chattering audibly while the preacher delivered sermons with a freezing, raspy voice. The air inside the church was often colder than the air outside, trapped in the shadows of the high, uninsulated ceiling. Yet, every morning at dawn, when the wealthy men of the valley stepped out onto their frozen porches, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, their breath pluming in thick white clouds, they would look up the hill, and there, standing outside his green door in nothing but a thin flannel shirt and a faded vest, was the old Mexican man, calmly feeding his mules. They told themselves he was just used to suffering. They told themselves his peasant blood was thicker. Their pride simply would not allow them to admit that the $23 dirt hole was outperforming their $300 estates. But a mother's desperation knows no pride. In the second week of January, Sarah Mitchell, the wife of a local cattle rancher, appeared at Tomas's door. She was holding the hand of her 7-year-old daughter, Lucy. The little girl had been fighting a severe respiratory infection for weeks. The constant freezing drafts in their wooden farmhouse were making her worse. Her cough was a deep, wet rattle, and her face was terrifyingly pale. Sarah knocked timidly on the green door. When Tomas opened it, the young mother physically took a step back, stunned by the wave of dry, stable, 66-degree air that washed over her freezing face. "Señor Rivera," Sarah whispered, her eyes red from crying. I heard whispers in the town. They say your house is warm. My little girl is so very sick. The wind in our house, it cuts right through her chest. Could we just sit inside for an hour? Just to let her thaw?" Tomas did not hesitate. He opened the door wide. "The warmth does not belong to me, señora. The earth provides it. Please, come in." Sarah and Lucy stepped into the silent, amber-lit cavern. The contrast was staggering. There was no roaring fire, just a few quiet embers in the hearth, yet the air felt like a gentle spring afternoon. They sat on a wooden bench carved from scrap pine. Within 15 minutes, the violent shivering that had plagued little Lucy for days finally stopped. The tension drained from the child's small shoulders. The warm, dry air opened her lungs, and for the first time in a week, she breathed deeply without a coughing fit. Within an hour, she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep on the bench. Sarah Mitchell sat in the quiet, dirt-walled room and wept. She cried tears of profound relief, but also tears of bitter realization. The poorest, most mocked man in the valley possessed the one thing all their money could not buy: peace from the cold. When she left 2 hours later, leaving a fresh loaf of bread on his table as a silent, desperate thank you, she carried the secret back to the valley. But the proud men, Harrison, Zimmerman, and Fletcher, refused to listen to a woman's emotional tale. They doubled down on their arrogance, ordering more firewood, sealing their windows with rags, and cursing the sky. They did not know that the sky was about to answer them. They did not know that the true test of their modern vanity was gathering just over the northern mountains, a beast of atmospheric pressure that would soon turn their wooden palaces into freezing tombs. And then, the beast arrived. On the 26th of January, 1886, the sky above the New Mexico territory did not simply darken. It bruised. It turned a sickly, sulphurous yellow, then shifted to a violent, grayish green, a terrifying atmospheric signature that the old native shepherds recognized as the harbinger of a cyclone bomb. The air grew unnervingly still. The birds ceased their singing and vanished into the brush. Down in the valley, horses stomped wildly in their wooden stalls, their eyes wide with panic, sweating despite the bitter cold. The barometric pressure plummeted so fast it made the settlers' ears pop. The thermometer read 15 degrees below zero, but it was a wet, heavy, paralyzing cold that bypassed the skin and settled directly into the marrow of the bone. By nightfall, the snow began. It was not a gentle, poetic winter snowfall. These were thick flakes the size of silver coins, falling in a dense, blinding curtain of absolute silence. By midnight, 3 inches blanketed the ground. By dawn on the 27th, 2 solid feet of snow had buried the Mora Valley. And then, the northern wind descended from the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains like a screaming, invisible leviathan. The wind caught the massive accumulation of snow and whipped it horizontally, creating a white hell, a blinding, roaring blizzard where visibility was reduced to less than 3 feet. The sheer acoustic violence of the gale was deafening. It sounded as if a dozen freight trains were endlessly circling the valley. The temperature went into a terrifying freefall. -20, -30, -35. Up in his magnificent 2-story wooden mansion, William Harrison was fighting a frantic, losing war against the sky. His massive $40 Franklin stove was glowing a dangerous cherry red, but the heat was simply vanishing. The physics of his expensive home were betraying him. Hot air rises, and the violent wind outside was creating a vacuum effect, sucking the warmth up the grand staircase and pulling it directly through the microscopic gaps in the uninsulated wooden roof. His 14 beautiful, expensive glass windows, the ultimate symbol of his wealth, were acting as massive sheets of ice, radiating freezing temperatures directly into the parlor. Harrison had burned through his entire supply of oak and pine in a matter of hours. Panic set in. He grabbed an axe and began to butcher his own imported furniture. He chopped up a heavy oak dining chair. He smashed a carved mahogany table. He threw the varnished wood into the iron beast, desperate for BTUs. But it was useless. His wife, Elizabeth, and their 2 small boys were huddled together on the floor in the center of the room, buried beneath every heavy quilt, wool blanket, and velvet curtain they owned. Yet, they shook violently. The boys' lips had turned the color of bruised plums. Harrison attempted to go outside to the woodshed, tying a scarf over his face, but the moment he opened the door, the wind physically threw him backward onto the floor. The snow slashed his cheeks like broken glass. He crawled back inside, bleeding and gasping, realizing with absolute horror that all the money in his bank accounts could not buy him a single degree of warmth. Deep in the belly of the hill, the roaring of the wind was nothing but a distant, muffled whisper. It sounded like the ocean held inside a seashell. The 1,000,000 tons of compacted earth pressing down on Tomas Rivera's ceiling completely neutralized the screaming gale. The massive thermal inertia of the dirt was performing exactly as the ancient ones knew it would. Tomas sat calmly on his wooden bench, wearing only a thick sweater and comfortable trousers. The temperature inside his home had finally dropped. Yes, but only to a perfectly stable 59 degrees Fahrenheit. He was now burning 6 logs a day instead of 4. The stone-lined, angled earthen chimney drew the smoke perfectly, completely unaffected by the chaotic wind pressure above, while the surrounding clay absorbed every ounce of heat from the flue. There were no drafts. There were no rattling windows. Tomas slowly ate a bowl of hot bean soup, the steam curling warmly around his weathered face. He took off his boots, resting his tired, calloused feet on the dry dirt floor, and read his worn Bible by the golden, unwavering light of a single tallow candle. His $23 dirt hole was an impenetrable, silent fortress of peace. Behind the freezing, draft-ridden church, Pastor John Fletcher was experiencing a literal hell of ice and smoke. The wind howling across the valley roofline was so ferocious that it created a violent downdraft in his proud, straight brick chimney. Instead of pulling smoke up, the storm violently shoved the smoke, ash, and freezing air back down into his small wooden cabin. The room rapidly filled with a thick, choking, toxic gray fog. Fletcher desperately tried to block the hearth with wet blankets, but the wind tore them away. He and his quiet, devoted wife, Margaret, faced a terrifying, agonizing ultimatum: suffocate in the toxic smoke, or let the fire die and freeze. They chose the cold. They knelt on the freezing floorboards, holding each other as the temperature in the room plummeted below zero. Fletcher, whose voice normally thundered with the absolute authority of divine judgment, now whispered through trembling, cracked lips. He begged for mercy, realizing that his profound architectural arrogance, his refusal to build low to the ground like a serpent, had built a deadly trap for the woman he loved. Less than a mile away, the master carpenter, Carl Zimmermann, was entirely broken. He had built his home using the finest, most advanced structural techniques of the civilized East. But the East did not know the ruthless fury of a high-desert cyclone bomb. His house was solid, but it was a thermal nightmare. It consumed wood at a terrifying speed. He had burned his entire winter reserve in 2 days. Now, shivering uncontrollably, his beard coated in frost from his own breath, the proud engineer was feeding the stove with the very tools of his trade. He snapped the wooden handles off his chisels and hammers. He sawed his heavy workbench into pieces, but it was like pouring water into a bottomless bucket. The heat instantly vanished through the thin walls. In the corner of the room, near the stove, his strong, robust German wife, Greta, had stopped shivering. Zimmermann knew exactly what that meant. It was the most terrifying physiological sign of all. Her body had given up trying to generate heat. Her skin had turned an ashen gray, and her eyes were half open, staring blankly at the wall. Hypothermia was quietly shutting down her organs. The master builder fell to his knees, his massive, skilled hands covering his face, weeping openly in the freezing dark. He had mocked the old Mexican man's intelligence. He had laughed at the ignorant peasant physics. And now, his perfect modern engineering was actively killing his wife. By the dawn of the 28th of January, the brutal peak of the storm hit. The mercury thermometer on Tomas's fence post froze solid at 42 degrees below zero. The sun eventually rose, but it was a mocking, pale disk hidden behind a blinding curtain of horizontal white. It offered light, but absolutely no heat. Out in the open fields, the devastating reality of the White Death took hold. Cattle caught away from the barns froze exactly where they stood, turning into morbid ice statues. Birds dropped dead from the branches of the cottonwood trees, frozen solid before they even hit the ground. To step outside into the wind meant the moisture in your lungs would begin to crystallize in a matter of minutes. The valley's elite were trapped in their beautiful, expensive, freezing coffins. Their money, their university degrees, their rigid theology, none of it could negotiate with the laws of thermodynamics. Nature was exacting a terrifying, unforgiving toll on their pride. And beneath the frozen surface of the earth, the humble man they had utterly despised sat in the quiet warmth, waiting for the storm to break. It was the afternoon of January the 29th when the invincible fortress of modern arrogance finally shattered. Deep within the quiet, amber-lit warmth of his subterranean home, Tomas Rivera heard a sound that did not belong to the howling rhythm of the storm. It was a faint, desperate thud against his heavy wooden door. Tomas stood up from his bench, set his Bible aside, and walked to the entrance. When he pulled the iron latch and cracked the door open, the violent wind nearly ripped it from its hinges, sending a blinding spray of ice into the room. A heavy figure, entirely encased in a thick crust of white frost, stumbled forward and collapsed onto the dry dirt floor. It was Robert Mitchell, the pragmatic cattle rancher. His beard was frozen into a solid block of ice, and his eyes were wide with a terror that only a man who has looked death in the face can possess. Tied tightly around his waist was a thick hemp rope, trailing out into the blinding white abyss. Thomas quickly shoved the door shut against the screaming gale and knelt beside the rancher, pulling off the man's frozen leather gloves. "Zimmerman!" Robert gasped, his voice broken and rattling. "His wife! She is dying. Harrison, his boys are freezing. I tied a line, from my porch, went house to house. I told them to come here." "Where are they?" Thomas demanded, grabbing a warm blanket from his cot. "Outside." Robert shivered violently, pointing a trembling finger at the thick wooden door. "They are huddled against your front wall. They would not knock. Harrison says he will not crawl into a hole. Zimmerman says he cannot ask an ignorant man for charity. They are letting their pride kill them." Thomas did not hesitate. He did not smile at his vindication. He did not feel the sweet thrill of revenge. He only felt the tragic, exhausting weight of human foolishness. He threw open the door and stepped out into the roaring, 42-degree below-zero nightmare. There, pressed desperately against the reclaimed wooden facade of his $23 home, were the wealthiest and most educated people in the Mora Valley. Sarah Mitchell was sobbing, shielding her daughter Lucy with her own freezing body. William Harrison, the man who had laughed at the madman's tomb, was clutching his 2 young sons, his face purple with frostbite. And Carl Zimmerman, the master builder who had arrogantly predicted this ceiling would collapse, was kneeling in the snow, cradling the limp, gray body of his wife, Greta. "Get inside!" Thomas roared over the deafening scream of the wind. "All of you, now!" One by one, the valley's elite stumbled over the threshold. As they crossed from the deadly, freezing chaos of the storm into the profound, stable, 60-something degree embrace of the earth, the physical shock was overwhelming. Harrison fell to his knees, weeping uncontrollably as the warm air hit his agonizingly cold skin. Zimmerman carried his wife inside and laid her gently on Tomas's canvas cot. Her breathing was impossibly shallow. Her lips were blue, and she was entirely unresponsive. "She is gone," the giant German carpenter whispered, his massive shoulders shaking with devastating grief. "My Greta is gone." "She is not gone," Thomas said, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a man who understood the rhythm of nature. "But her fire is low. Everyone, strip off your wet coats. Wrap yourselves in the dry blankets from that trunk." Thomas moved with absolute precision. He took 3 large river stones that had been resting near the gentle fire, wrapped them tightly in thick wool cloths, and placed them around Greta's shivering body, 1 at her feet and 2 under her arms. He understood that the thermal mass of the stones would transfer heat slowly and safely to her core, mimicking the very physics of his earthen home. He poured drops of warm, sweet tea past her pale lips. For an hour, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of chattering teeth and quiet, ragged breathing. And then Greta Zimmerman coughed. Her eyelids fluttered open, and a faint rush of pink returned to her cheeks. She looked up at the curved dirt ceiling, then at her weeping husband. "Where are we?" she whispered. "We are safe," Zimmerman choked out, burying his face in her hands. "We are safe." William Harrison, Watching his own children finally stop shivering as they drank warm milk by the hearth, slowly stood up. He looked at the perfectly smooth dirt walls. He looked at the simple, angled stone chimney that drew the smoke flawlessly while their massive brick chimneys had failed. He looked at the old Mexican man he had mocked and despised. "Rivera," Harrison began, his voice thick with profound shame. I said unforgivable things to you. I called you—" "Now is not the time," Tomas interrupted softly, placing a hand on the merchant's shoulder. "Pride is a luxury for the summer. Right now, only living matters. But tell me, where is Pastor Fletcher?" Robert Mitchell looked down at the dirt floor. "I knocked on his door. He refused to open it. He shouted through the wood that God was testing him, that he would not seek shelter in the belly of a serpent. He is still in his cabin." Tomas walked to the corner of the room, picked up his heavy canvas coat, and began to put it on. He took the heavy hemp rope from Robert Mitchell's waist and tied it securely around his own. "What are you doing?" Harrison asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You cannot go back out there. It is suicide. You will freeze in 3 minutes." "I know this valley," Tomas replied calmly, pulling his scarf over his mouth and nose. "And I know the cold. If I do not return in 30 minutes, pull the rope. If you feel dead weight, keep pulling until I am inside." "Why?" Zimmerman asked, stepping forward. "He called you a pagan. He insulted your grandfather's memory. Let his pride bury him." Tomas paused at the door, his hand resting on the iron latch. He looked back at the master builder. "Because if I let a man die just to prove that I was right, then my pride is no different than his, and the earth has no use for proud dead men." He opened the door and vanished into the roaring white oblivion. The journey to Fletcher's wooden church was normally a casual 5-minute walk. In the heart of the cyclone bomb, it was an agonizing 20-minute battle for survival. Tomas moved hunched over, his hands gripping the rope that anchored him to the living world. The wind battered him relentlessly, trying to tear him from his feet. The cold bit through his coat, turning the sweat on his skin into thousands of microscopic icy needles. When he finally blindly collided with the wall of the preacher's cabin, he found the door frozen shut. He hit it with his shoulder. Once, twice, until the ice shattered and the wood splintered open. The inside of the cabin was a freezing, smoke-filled tomb. Pastor Fletcher was kneeling on the floor, his arms wrapped around his unconscious wife, Margaret. The preacher's face was a mask of frost and defeat. "Rivera!" Fletcher gasped, his arrogant voice reduced to a pathetic, dying wheeze. "Get up," Tomas ordered, coughing through the toxic smoke. "I cannot," the preacher whispered, a single tear freezing on his cheek. "This is my punishment. God has judged my vanity." "God is throwing you a rope," Tomas yelled over the wind. "Do not insult him by refusing to grab it. Help me lift her." Together, they dragged Margaret out into the blinding storm. Tomas kept one arm wrapped tightly around the woman, his other hand gripping the lifeline. Every single step back toward the dirt hole was an excruciating negotiation with death. Fletcher fell twice, nearly dragging them all into the deep drifts, but Tomas's calloused, hardened hands refused to let go of the rope. When the heavy wooden door of the subterranean house finally slammed shut behind them, sealing out the roaring hell, Fletcher collapsed onto the warm dirt floor. He looked around the room, gasping for the warm, dry air. He saw the wealthy merchant feeding the fire. He saw the master carpenter tending to his wife. He saw 11 souls, brought together not by money, not by status, but by the undeniable, humbling power of ancestral wisdom. For the next 2 days, The storm raged, but inside the $23 dirt hole, there was only peace. They ate meager rations of dry bread and beans. They slept in shifts. But mostly, they talked. They talked without the suffocating masks of their social status. Harrison confessed his terrifying fear of poverty. Zimmerman admitted that his university engineering had blinded him to the actual environment. And on the final night, Pastor Fletcher crawled over to where Tomas was sitting, knelt on the dirt floor, and wept. He begged for forgiveness, acknowledging that true divine wisdom was found not in towering spires, but in the quiet, humble embrace of the earth. On the morning of January the 31st, the howling finally stopped. Tomas opened the door to a world that had been completely erased. The valley was buried under immense, sweeping dunes of blinding white snow, glittering under a cruel, crystalline blue sky. The temperature was still bitterly cold, but the lethal wind was dead. The survivors stepped out, blinking against the harsh light, and looked down at their magnificent town. It was a graveyard of ambition. Harrison's massive wooden mansion stood intact, but inside, every single iron pipe had burst. The beautiful imported wallpaper was peeling from the freezing moisture, and the expensive furniture was reduced to ashes. Zimmerman's perfectly engineered home was a cracked, groaning shell, and Fletcher's church had partially collapsed under the sheer weight of the snow on its high, uninsulated roof. In the surrounding fields, the toll was catastrophic. Over 100 head of cattle, dozens of horses, and entire flocks of sheep had frozen to death. 3 isolated settlers in the upper canyons who refused to leave their wooden cabins were found weeks later, frozen in their beds. Yet, 11 people who had taken refuge in a dirt hole that the entire town had mocked as a tomb walked out without a single case of severe frostbite. The story of the survival spread far beyond the Mora Valley. Newspapers in Santa Fe and Denver sent reporters to photograph the Miracle Cave, though Tomas politely turned them away, insisting there was no miracle, only the memory of his grandfather. But the valley had learned its lesson. That spring, a profound architectural shift occurred. Carl Zimmerman, the humbled master carpenter, drafted new blueprints for the town. He began designing semi-subterranean homes, berming the north, east, and west walls with thousands of pounds of compacted earth, leaving only the south face exposed to the winter sun. William Harrison rebuilt his home, but this time it was a modest, single-story structure with double-thick walls insulated with packed straw and a fraction of the windows. Pastor Fletcher rebuilt his church using thick, earthen adobe bricks, keeping the roof low and the heat trapped inside. They no longer built to impress the East. They built to survive the West. Tomas Rivera lived for another 19 years in his quiet, subterranean sanctuary. Every winter, while the blizzards raged, he slept in warm peace. Every summer, while the sun baked the valley floor, he enjoyed the cool, natural air conditioning of the deep earth. His estranged youngest son, hearing the legendary tale of his father's survival, eventually returned from California, weeping with shame. He stayed, building his own earthen home just 50 yards away, and gave Tomas the ultimate gift: grandchildren whose laughter echoed off the smooth dirt walls. When Tomas finally passed away in his sleep in 1903, at the age of 77, the entire valley attended his funeral. William Harrison, now an old man, delivered the eulogy. Carl Zimmerman built his coffin free of charge from the finest oak, and Pastor Fletcher spoke the final prayer, declaring to the massive crowd that Tomas Rivera had taught them all that true wisdom does not come from books, banks, or pride. It comes from observing, from remembering, and from humbling oneself before the overwhelming power of nature. His original earthen home stood for another 50 years, eventually collapsing only because the wooden supports were left to rot. The earth simply opened up and swallowed the house back into the hillside, returning it to the mother that had provided the warmth. But the legacy of the Rivera houses forever changed the architectural DNA of the region, eventually inspiring modern sustainable, passive solar, and earthship designs used across the globe today. This story, my friends, is a mirror held up to our modern times. It shows us something deeply uncomfortable about the way we live today. How many times have we dismissed a brilliant, life-saving idea simply because it came from someone who lacked a degree, a title, or a fat bank account? How many times have we chosen what is expensive over what is efficient? What is impressive over what is functional? What is new over what is proven? Are we William Harrison, buying massive windows we do not need just to make our neighbors jealous? Are we Carl Zimmerman, placing blind faith in modern systems that collapse the moment nature decides to flex its muscles? Or are we the pastor, rejecting the deep, ancestral truths of the earth simply because they do not fit into our rigid, pre-packaged worldview? Tomas Rivera was not a superhero. He was just a tired, grieving, marginalized old man who remembered a truth his grandfather taught him. But that single memory, paired with the humility to execute it while the whole world laughed, saved generations. Our world today is full of storms. Perhaps they are not cyclone bombs dropping the temperature to 40 below zero. Perhaps they are economic storms, social blizzards, or crises of energy and resources that leave us feeling frozen and helpless. In the face of these modern storms, we need more people like Tomas. We need men and women willing to dig deep, to build quietly, to ignore the mockery of the elite, and to trust in the resilient, low-tech wisdom of the past. If this story of poetic justice, quiet resistance, and ancestral survival resonated with you, if it reminded you that the smartest solution is often the simplest one, then I ask you to do something. Share this audio documentary with someone who needs to hear that it is okay to build their life differently than the crowd. Tell me in the comments below, from which city or country are you listening to this history? Leave your like to show the algorithm that the wisdom of our grandfathers is more valuable than any modern trend. And please subscribe to this channel, because here at Legado Austral, we are committed to unearthing the forgotten stories that the arrogant modern world has tried to bury. Because in the end, when the bitter cold of life's greatest storms inevitably beats against your door, it will not be your money, your car, or your pride that saves you. It will be the depth of your preparation, the strength of your humility, and the quiet warmth of your wisdom. And if you build your life on the solid truth of the earth, when the proud and the lost come shivering to your doorstep, you will be able to open the door, look them in the eye, and say, "You are safe now. The earth does not lie. Come inside."